Right, the recording is in progress. Um, David, can I just check with you that you can see this okay?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to miniaturize myself so I don't have to look at myself. So yes, here we are. And it's funny because I think it was probably 3 years ago this time, 3 years ago, we had a kind of a dinner and a sort of get together at Wiltshire Museum talking about the show. And at the time it was sort of, we'd had the idea, but hadn't really done much more than that. And here we are. And it's lovely that we're sort of halfway, a bit more than halfway through it. And people have been enjoying it so much, which is obviously wonderful from all of our points of view. So how it came about, I'll just say very quickly, I am an art historian. I work with modern British art primarily, 20th century British art, and I curated the Ravilious exhibition at Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2015. And at that time, I'd written a series of books called Ravilious in Pictures, which looked at Eric Ravilious' watercolours from a sort of perspective of looking at the stories behind the works and so forth. And rather than sort of strict art history, I suppose you could say. And in one of the books, but the first one, in fact, which was called Sussex and the Downs, while I was researching it, we discovered that there was this incredible Ravilious relic, this lost artifact, and it was a kind of publisher's dummy, a little kind of a sort of stapled together leaflet, essentially, with designs for a book kind of laid out roughly on it. And Ravilious had prepared this, and it was to be called White Horse or Downland Man, had prepared this for a publisher, and then had vanished. And Ravilious had died on active service in 1942 as a war artist, and it was felt that maybe he'd taken it with him, maybe it had gone down with him when he was lost in a plane crash, and people had tried to find it and failed. And so we mentioned this in the text of the book. The next thing I knew was a very elderly artist called Roland Collins, who had been around long enough to have been exhibiting before World War II. And this was in 2011 or so. He said, "Oh, it's not lost. It's not lost at all. I've got it on my bookshelf." And it had been on his bookshelf since about 1950, when the publisher had given it to him. Now, Roland then put this object, this dummy, up for auction, and the kind of Ravilious watchers, the kind of nerdy group of fans, were all wondering what was going to happen to it, which crazy super fan would end up buying this thing. And it ended up, we were incredibly surprised to discover, it ended up at the Wiltshire Museum, where it had been bid for by David. And so I went along to see it in 2012, and I realized that it was exactly the right place for this artifact, for reasons I hope will become clear as I go through the lecture. And as we were standing there looking at this thing, David said, "Well, we really should do a show. We should do an exhibition." So that was almost 10 years ago, and here we are now. And one of the reasons for me, rather than just sort of doing an exhibition for the sake of it, there was a very genuine, to me, a very genuine kind of connection between Ravilious and the South Downs. He was born in London but raised in Eastbourne, so he was brought up, in fact, he was brought up in what was then a tiny settlement north of Eastbourne called Hampden Park. It's now a big suburb, but at the time, he was born 1903, so he was moved there in about 1908, and it was basically a railway stop and 2 streets, and then to the west, about 3 miles away, the Downs rose, rising in a great wall, as they obviously still do today. So the Downs were always there for him. He had in many ways, a very ordinary childhood, running around outside playing. But he was very good at drawing, and this skill in drawing took him to the Eastbourne School of Art on a scholarship, and then the Royal College of Art, where you can see him here with a cigarette, with his typically nonchalant expression on his face. He always was one of those people who gave the impression of never doing a stroke of work, but obviously he did work very hard, because you don't do what he did without working hard, as we all know. So by the time he was a student, he had not only got to know the Downs as a place, he had become drawn into the kind of growing culture surrounding the Downs, primarily a literary culture. So a book he knew very well, and if you haven't read it, I would thoroughly recommend, is The South Country by Edward Thomas, published in 1909, which has this fabulous line: "The long white roads are a temptation. What quests they propose! They take us away to the thin air of the future, or the underworld of the past." And that was it. That, particularly the second sentence, "They take us away to the thin air of the future, or the underworld of the past." The idea that the Downs, and he was talking about the South, coming to the South Downs around Brighton, I think, because he was coming down from London. The idea that the downland, the sort of shape, the smoothness, suggested something very contemporary. And then you had the connection with the past through the ancient monuments and so forth. And by the time Ravilious was sort of growing up, the Downs were entering the mythology of the country, and particularly after the First World War, when there was an awful lot of soul searching about how Britain and Germany had got themselves, 2 civilized countries had got themselves into this appalling slaughter, and a kind of a desire to find a more innocent world and a more innocent past. And people saw the downland cultures, the prehistoric cultures, very much in that light, while also exploring the Downs as an escape from the cities. And from Ravilius's point of view, when he began turning his drawings into watercolors, watercolor, as we'll see in a minute, was becoming very much in vogue. As he began, as many draftsmen did, and historically had always done, turn their drawings, tinted them, turned them into watercolors. Of course, it was downland subjects that he explored. And he made this particular drawing. It's a terrible photograph I took in someone's house. You can see my reflection there, because it's not a work that's ever really been photographed properly. And I must get around to getting someone to do it sometime. But he had been he was on a sketching tour with his friend Donald Towner, who founded the Towner Gallery later on. And they were obviously young. They were just finished art school and about to go to, in Ravilius's case, the Royal College. And they went on this tour, and they wandered around. A Towner left a description of their adventures together, and he described following an old coach road, now completely grassed over, through woods. Along this road were the remains of fine old 17th century houses, now empty and crumbling, in one of which there was a fine central staircase which divided halfway, with old oak panels hanging loose from the walls. This is like something from Le Grand Monde, if you know that book. They were deeply romantic. these young people, and they made their way to Amberley, and where Ravilious made this sketch. And he showed these sketches in the sketch club at the Royal College. Now, while he was there, he and his good friend Edward Borden, who he met on day one, they were in the design school at the Royal College, being from not wealthy backgrounds. Ravilius's dad had various businesses, including an antique shop, but they were not wealthy. Borden's family, similar. They were in the design school, but they were encouraged to also explore the various art options open to them. And of course, the V&A was right next door. They had a connecting door so they could explore the works in there. And they were encouraged in their interest in watercolor. So Ravilious found John Sell Cotman, and he was exhibited in 1922 for the first time in many years in a big show in London to rave reviews. Francis Town, who was another artist being rediscovered very much in the early 20th century, and the source of the Aveyron, a glacier in the Alps, was one of Ravilius's favorite works, which you can sort of understand. It's not at all like one of his watercolors, but has that lovely, simple placing of light against dark and these lovely planes of color, which were very much part of his work. And it also conveys great scale, even though the picture itself is very small, and which was something, again, Ravilious aspired to. So the artists in the early 20th century, there was a movement of artists who were exploring watercolor and exploring landscape. John Nash became a great friend of Ravilius's later in life, and produced a lot of lovely, kind of quite naive drawings before the war. And then, of course, Paul Nash, John's brother, he had been a war artist, and then he taught Ravilious and Borden at the design school for a year in 1924-5. At just the time he was having his first major peacetime exhibition since the war at the Leicester Galleries, which was a very large show of oils and a great many watercolors, which impressed the youngsters very much. Nash was exceedingly debonair. He must have been about in his late 30s by then, and he had his hair oiled, and he spoke in a very quite posh, quite mannered way, and knew everybody and helped people get started. And in watercolor, Ravilious got started really with works like this one, that he a watercolor he made he always called them drawings in the old way. The 18th century artists always called their watercolors drawings, and that's how he referred to them. So he made this drawing in the summer of 1923 during the holidays, and then showed it in the sketch show. And it was bought by Martin Hardy, who was probably one of the top 3 watercolor experts in the country. So he obviously thought Ravilious had something. And it's called One at Dupont. And at first, all you can see is a lot of slightly overworked and slightly somber colored landscape. But then if you follow, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but if you follow the line of the hill nearest to us from left to right, you eventually come down right at this lovely point in the corner to this cigar-shaped indentation or mark. And that is the dew pond, which of course has been carved into the chalk. And a dew pond is really just a rain pond, and they're dug. They were dug up on the downs because the chalk is porous and the rainwater goes straight through underground. And so the farmers would dig out a pond, cover it in mud to stop it being porous, and then that was used for livestock to drink. So this was a part of a working landscape. The area around there, so this is just above Hampden Park where he grew up, you know, an energetic half-hour bike ride, if that. But he chose not to focus on anything old. He chose not to focus on pure landscape. He focused on something man-made in the landscape, part of the human landscape. And this is really how he always saw the Downs. The Downs was something he grew up with. He didn't revere the Downs as something precious to be protected that he saw at a distance. It was part of his everyday life. And here's another pond, not a dew pond, a farm pond, but it has a similar quality of having been dug into the chalk. And you can sort of see his mature way of working beginning to emerge here in the strokes of the grass and the contrasting textures. And of course, this was 1927. People were trying to be modern, and so the bare ground around this newly dug pond is a kind of something new and interesting in among the old traditional buildings. Here's Littlington, Sussex, in a sort of voguish way of working of the day, of placing buildings among trees, although in fact, of course, this was again harking back, and there was he had a whole load of people he could reference and look at, and he did study watercolors, old watercolors, constantly throughout his career. During the war, even, he rushed into the V&A to go and revise some Cotmans or whoever it was that he was thinking about as he was making watercolors. So here's an 18th century work showing buildings among trees and the foliage, and here is his 20th century version. The foliage slightly simplified and stylized, and the whole mood lightened, which was a sort of way of working he got from Nash, who in turn it sort of filtered through from Cézanne. So it was a way of creating a modern take on the old watercolor tradition. I was chatting with someone today about this work, Firle Beacon, and I'm not sure, I can't remember who it was, and they may well be listening. And they were saying that a friend of theirs who was a Ravilious fan had been around and looked at a lot of the places where he'd worked and where the vantage points he'd chosen. And one of them was this one. And they said, of course, well, when you go there, where you can see this view from is in a churchyard, and there's hedges and walls and stuff, and there isn't a fence like this. And I was explaining that when you see a Ravilious work, most of the time, with a few exceptions, most of the time, what you're seeing is a fiction. You're seeing a redesigned version of what he saw, and often with different elements transposed from one place to another. So the fence may have been there at the time, or it may have been a fence that he brought in from somewhere else. And then he's used it. He was still very young at this point, only 24, only really getting started. But Firle Beacon, the subject, is just this tiny little hump over here. And everything else is all the incident which frames it, the clouds and the dramatic trees and so forth, and the fence. You can see the sort of similar fencing again in this wood engraving. And it was as a wood engraver that Ravilious really first made his mark. These early watercolors didn't make much of an impact on anybody. And you can see initially, this is from the the magazine of the Royal College that was edited by his friend Douglas Percy Bliss. And you can see right away when you look, and this is I can't remember the church. It's described, it's a Sussex church. It's described as the smallest church in Britain, but I've been to at least 3 churches which were the smallest church in Britain. So we'll have to leave that as moot. But you can see right away when you look at his engravings, if you've ever really looked at wood engraving, what he was doing was different from what other people were doing, primarily because he would pick out these areas of pattern. and he had a whole set of lovely set of tools. And if you went to the Dulwich show in 2015, you would have seen them there, that he made himself with wooden handles and little sharp points, little blades. And the blocks he was working on, boxwood blocks, were very small. This one is only probably, well, I can't remember, 4 inches across, possibly 4 or 5 inches across. And then he would spend hours picking out this pattern to create a sort of very textured and animated kind of world in his engraving. And of course, this method that he found in medieval or early modern prints made printed from metal cuts, and those were sort of poked with holes by the printmakers, and so he's using a similar technique, updating it, bringing it into the 20th century, repurposing it. And it was very good for giving that sense of light shining through the turf, or the chalk, the white chalk shining through the turf of Downland. And he used this to good effect in various engravings of the time. This one, clearly fictional. As far as I know, there is no Aries, or there is no sort of figure like this, a shepherd figure on the cliffs anywhere. But this one is real, and is, of course, the Long Man of Wilmington, just outside Eastbourne, as we all know it, the Wilmington giant, as he always called it. And in fact, Ravilious was convinced at this time in the late 20s that it was a giantess, hence the rounded hips. And he had a sort of his own one-man little pagan cult around this sort of mysterious giantess, I think, which he portrayed in various ways, as we'll see, and as we see in the exhibition. Now, these illustrations, this one and this one, came from an almanac, essentially a sort of diary, desk diary, that was given out by a company, and he was commissioned to do illustrations for it. So a sort of throwaway gift, really. It's become a fantastic collector's item over the years. And this one, to me, really sums up Ravillious's attitude to the Downs, as you've got the dew pond, you've got the leaping bull of Taurus, you've got the fig chalk figure, you've got a little sign sitting there, you've got some bushes. It's a sort of very ordinary and down-to-earth environment in some ways, and a place of dreaming and magic on another. And Ravilious himself was a great dreamer. He loved to write down his dreams and record them and tell people about them. And there is a sense in which the world he gave us in his artworks has this sort of element of quality of dream in it. Here's the giantess again, and here the Downs, and here's the old dew pond, and this is a sort of extended version of the landscape around Wilmington, where the giant is. And on this occasion, he and Edward Borden were commissioned to design murals. They were very much in vogue in the 20s, murals. Rex Whistler made the fabulous ones in the dining room at Tate, and they were all over the place, now sadly mostly gone. And so Ravilious and Borden were commissioned to make these ones at a working men's college. And they filled all the walls of this sort of refectory room with these huge floor-to-ceiling murals of theatrical scenes. But of course, they couldn't resist embellishing with flying figures, which they got from trips they made to Italy and visiting Pompeii. And then, of course, Ravilious places his beloved Downs as a backdrop. Now, these murals were very successful, and these were the first time that successful in the sense that it wasn't that someone bought them, but people were very interested in them. And the then Queen Mother went along to have a look, and the press came, and there were lots of photographs, and Ravilious and Borden found themselves in the art magazines and the sort of weekly picture magazines and so forth. And because of this, Ravilious found himself in a with enough temporary wealth to ask the hand in marriage of Tirzah Garwood, who was also from Eastbourne and who came from rather different circumstances than him. He, as I said, his family was chapel going. His dad had various shops. It wasn't particularly successful. Tirzah's dad was a colonel in the Royal Engineers, very respectable, Church of England. She had what she described as a pipe-smoking husband waiting for her in the wings once she'd finished her education. But in the meantime, she went along to the Eastbourne School of Art and was taught by Ravilious and emerged very rapidly as an exceedingly good wood engraver. And this is one of hers. She was easily as good as he was. And had she had the sort of wood engraving explosion kept going as it had in the 20s, she would have enjoyed, I think, a really good career. She had a great sense of humor and a sort of great eye. But here we have her passengers in a railway carriage with, of course, the Downs in the background. So they were married in 1930. He was able to say to Colonel Garwood, look, look how affluent I am. Look how much money I've earned from all of my sort of things. And Tirzah later said that he never, ever earned as much as he did that year in his life. But nevertheless, they were married. And new avenues began to open up, partly on the back of the success of the Morley College murals. He began teaching at the Royal College, and he was invited by patrons to make work. And in 1932, he was invited to Orr House near Pewsey by Sir Geoffrey Fry, who was the private secretary to Stanley Baldwin. And Stanley Baldwin had opened the Morley College mural, so they had met each other then. And Sir Geoffrey was one of those lovely people who uses their position and their wealth not to help themselves, but to help other people as they're getting started in their chosen careers. And years later, when Sir Geoffrey died, his obituaries described how if you went to his house at the weekend, you might find a sort of an up-and-coming school teacher, a civil servant, musicians, Olympic runners, artists, you name it. He cultivated people and helped them. Now, Ravilious liked him because, as Ravilious put it, Sir Geoffrey was the only man I know not as yet roped into the general zoo of the art world. So relations with him are particularly free and easy. And Eric later recalled how he'd been there one day having dinner and was got a bit overexcited and flung a glass of wine more or less across the table, and everyone just carried on. Sir Geoffrey just carried on as if nothing had happened, while someone came and mopped up the wine. And while he was there, Ravilious painted several watercolours that Sir Geoffrey commissioned from him, and this really, really helped him get started. This first trip to Wiltshire. So here's a lovely drawing of people working picking fruit or working under the strawberry nets at Orr House. Notice the way that he's portrayed the nets himself, and the fact that the work is called Strawberry Nets, because that is where he has put so much work and so much attention to what he's been seeing, and attention to detail in the drawing to give that lovely sense of the net billowing overhead. And he went up into the landscape and made 2 or 3 watercolors of the surrounding landscape. Unfortunately, these works are all in a private collection. Unfortunately, they weren't available for the exhibition, so it's nice to be able to look at them now. The next kind of place that where he was able to really expand as a watercolorist and move on as a watercolor painter was this completely different, talk about a different house. Wow. This little very down-to-earth shepherd's cottage, farm cottage in Sussex, close to Lewes. In fact, if you go to Charleston Farmhouse and you walk from Charleston to Firle, which is sort of a couple of miles to the east, and then you walk another couple of miles east, you will end up here. And it was a cottage that was taken on, half of it, the far end from where we're looking, was taken on by Ravilious' friend Peggy Angus, who had also been at the Royal College, had become an art teacher, struggling artist, but property was so cheap in the countryside in those days that even as an art teacher, she was able to rent this place for sort of all the time, but for holidays and so forth, from the farmer, Dick Freeman. And the legend goes that he didn't want to rent it to her at all. So she basically pitched a tent outside and refused to move till he relented. And that was in 1933. And she was still there. She still had the place on her death in the 1980s, 90s, paying the same peppercorn rent that he had asked her for back in 1933. This is my not very ordnance survey map of the local area. And so here is Furlongs here, and here's Firle, the village of Firle, and here is Charleston Farmhouse over here. And then we have Beddingham Hill, a couple of dew ponds up here. The late lamented Trevor Arms, a lovely pub, which as far as I know is closed at the moment. And so when people came to see Peggy, they would alight at Glynde Station. In those days, the A27 wasn't quite as mad as it is now, so you could cross it without being killed, and then come up here and come round to the cottage. On his Rodmill, where Virginia Woolf lived. And you'll notice the Asham cement works. And when Ravilious arrived, I'll come back to that. First of all, here is Furlongs, the cottage, and here is the view up towards Beddingham Hill, looking south. And it's a curious work because it looks quite straightforward, but it's actually in a way quite experimental. The perspective is peculiar. If you try to actually stand where the work is made from, the viewpoint, you would sort of have to be about 15 feet tall. And Edward Borden, when he saw this watercolor after having not seen it for many years, said, well, this is completely ridiculous. That child there would never fit through the door of the outdoor privy, which is this little building here, which is, I suppose, true. But Borden would like a joke like that. It was a very, very primitive place. One of the reasons Ravilious liked it, it was very basic. The outdoor privy, a well, mattresses stuffed with chaff, no rules and regulations, and lots of interesting places to explore. And one of them was the cement works, which had been built around, under Asham House, which was Virginia Woolf's first home in Sussex, where she wrote The Voyage Out and so forth. And by the time Ravilious arrived there, the scene was more like this, a terrible eyesore, a blot on the landscape as most people saw it. But to Ravilious, a fascinating place of strange whitened buildings and toy trains and all kinds of fun things like that. And for Peggy, who he explored with, Peggy was Scottish, and she was a Scottish nationalist, a very fervent anti-English Scottish woman, but also a communist who had visited Soviet Russia at the beginning of the decade and had come back full of enthusiasm for all things communist. And so for her, the cement works was a fantastic opportunity to paint workers in their natural habitat, whereas for Ravilious, I think he almost saw the cement pit, and this one is in the exhibition. He almost saw the cement pit as a sort of miniature version of the Alps, or the landscapes that were painted by his heroes from the 18th century. And he was a sort of modern, brand new, literally just cut out of the earth, a modern version of that old, the 18th century scene. And then there was the Downs themselves, which I mentioned when I was talking about Edward Thomas at the beginning, and he was thinking about the thin air of the future and also of the past. Now, this is the view down from Mount Caburn, with the cottage here furlongs, sorry, from Beddingham Hill, the cottage here, and then Mount Caburn in the distance, and Lewis over to our left. And as I said, the Downs, Thomas was very kind of prescient when he saw the Downs as being related to the future, because by the late 20s, people were getting very excited by Downland as something modern. And Paul Nash captured it brilliantly when he presented a beach hangar almost as a sort of wing of a motor car, with these beautifully stylized kind of Art Deco style hills. And that poster, this became he made into a print, and it was one of those prints that if you were a sort of young, groovy, art-loving person in London, you had that print alongside your print of Van Gogh's Sunflowers, which everyone had to have. So for Ravilious, he looked at the landscape that he knew around furlongs, that he was discovering really with Peggy and with his experience of wood engraving behind him. And he found his own way to present the landscape, not as smooth curves, but as something slightly kind of scratchier and edgier, angular, with the chalk paths running along, and then this barbed wire fence, this kind of quite hard metal fence, kind of stitching the whole composition together. This is a sort of stylized version of the scene at the top of Beddingham Hill, and this is at the bottom of Beddingham Hill, looking up again, Downs in winter, in which he's presented a field roller, which was in use every day by the farmers, as a sort of ancient artifact. And you'll notice the way he has started the bottom of the handles here, a light against the dark roller, and at the top they're dark against the light land. So you get this sense of movement as your eye moves along, and then the movement of the dark against light, light against dark, even though it's a very simple and static image. And then he's used almost his technique from wood engraving of pattern making to create the different shapes of the hills. So the Downs were becoming very interesting to people in a kind of in a wide-ranging way. And I mentioned after the Great War, people were looking for a sort of more innocent world to immerse themselves in. And in 1926, the writer H.J. Massingham wrote Downland Man, in which he presented a sort of imaginative, not archaeology, he wasn't an archaeologist, but a sort of an imaginative interpretation of civilization spreading from ancient Egypt into Britain, with Avebury becoming the great temple of this civilization, this prehistoric, pre-Roman civilization. And of course, these people who lived up on the Downs and worshipped at Avebury and so forth were scholars, they were peace-loving. And so these are presented as our ancestors rather than the Romans, who were very keen on conquest. And this book sold like hotcakes. And it was part of an exploration of the Downs, which was done literally by people like Alexander Keeler and O.G.S. Crawford, who Alexander Keeler, always known as the Marmalade Millionaire, the heir to a fortune in marmalade, who was very interested in archaeology, and launched into the excavations at Avebury in the early 1930s. And O.G.S. Crawford, who worked in maps, worked for the Ordnance Survey, and was very interested in aerial photography. And the two of them together produced a book, Wessex from the Air, full of aerial photographs of the archaeological sites. So aerial photography could not be more modern. It was a whole new way of looking. Rather, it's like Google Earth appearing for the first time. Nobody had been able to study the land from above like this, and now you could, and you were looking at ancient landscape in a very new way. Of course, Avebury, I love this photograph. Avebury had been enjoyed, particularly since the sort of later 19th century, when the railways enable people to travel more, and there were more guidebooks, and people had a little bit more leisure time. But this accelerated, and then in 1930s, as I said, Keeler began excavating at Avebury. And this kind of work found its way into the popular consciousness in newspaper reports, in the sort of antiquarian magazines, and it inspired artists. And Paul Nash was one of the people to be inspired by Avebury, which he always said, and apologized to David, he always said he preferred it in its wild state before Keeler got his hands on it. When he first saw it, and all the sort of the stones were all fallen over in the turf. And he saw it very much as being the artist he was, very much as a symbolic landscape, which he played with and which he used to kind of explore stories. He also explored Maiden Castle, which again was very much in the news. This was photographed by Major George Allen, another great aerial photographer of the day, who photographed everything obliquely so that you got a lovely sense not only of literally what it looked like from above, but its kind of sculptural quality, its three-dimensional qualities. And Maiden Castle was at that time very much in the news because it was also being excavated by the showman himself, Mortimer Wheeler, and his wife Tessa Verney Wheeler, in the early days before she sadly died young. But Mortimer Wheeler was incredible at he would have done really well today, actually. He would have been all over social media. He used the social media of the day, i.e. the newspapers and so forth. And he was always in the Times or in the antiquarian magazines and the picture magazines, telling people about his discoveries, and also funding 3 or 4 years of digging purely by public subscription, which seems extraordinary now, that achievement. And some of the sort of tales he told about that how, for example, the graves they found were of brave Iron Age fighters who died protecting the Maiden Castle from the Romans, I think today are seen very much as invented. But of course, they struck a chord at the time in the late 30s with the rise of fascism, and the fear of Nazi Germany, and it kept people fascinated by what he was doing. So the ancient landscapes were very much of the moment, and of course Paul Nash loved Maiden Castle too. He wrote I'm not sure if I've got a picture of it. Here it is. He wrote a guidebook. So Shell, the oil company, produced a series of guidebooks, and they cleverly got artists to do them because artists would provide all the imagery and they wouldn't then have to pay for them. But also Nash himself was a great writer, and he wrote all kinds of lovely descriptions, very sort of not really what you'd expect from a guidebook. So with Maiden Castle, he wrote, "Its presence today after the immense passage of time is miraculously undisturbed, the huge contours strike into even the most vulgar mind. The impervious nitwits who climbed onto the megaliths of Stonehenge to be photographed slink out of the shadow of the maiden uneasily. So this is, he wrote a whole guidebook like that, which makes it fabulous reading. But of course, Shell, a business which sold oil to people who had cars and drove around and petrol, they were very aware of this new excitement about the ancient landscapes and about Downland, and used this in their advertising. So here is Stonehenge in 1931. Here is the Long Man of Wilmington again, a very jaunty view of the Long Man of Wilmington from 1932. And my favourite, the Cerne Abbas giant, painted by Frank Dobson. Now, whether the censorship was done by him, as he was commissioned to do this and then thought, hang on a minute, I can't actually present the giant for a poster, or whether he presented it uncensored and then they had someone quickly rush in and paint in some cloud shadows, I don't know, but it is a marvelous image. I wonder, and this is entirely my own theory and it's probably completely false, whether Ravilious painted Causeway Wiltshire Downs, which is in the exhibition, whether he was hoping or thinking that it might be taken on as a Shell poster. I don't know. He's one of very few artists of his caliber at the time who were interested in landscape and didn't make a Shell poster. And perhaps this is one that might have been. Anyway, so somebody told me today exactly where this was, which every time someone tells me, I immediately forget, but it's very much on the eastern edge of the county. And it's a wonderful sort of open, airy view. I was mentioned earlier about scale. He manages to get a sense of scale, even though all of his watercolors are only, no more than sort of 60, 70 centimeters across. He had an exhibition coming. He'd had two exhibitions in 1933 and 1936 of watercolors, then had a bit of a hiatus, and then had an exhibition coming in 1939. And for it, he got himself really going to produce some wonderful work. So here is, I think, one of his finest works, Beachy Head, a very modern view of the lighthouse, which plays with the kind of approach taken by Samuel Palmer, who was one of his heroes, the 19th century artist, and was a sort of a figure that was revered by Ravilious and his peers and people like Paul Nash and Graham Sutherland, and generally had this sort of wonderful light. He was very religious, Samuel Palmer, and so it was a very sort of spiritual Christian light that flowed into his work and into the sky. And Ravilius's case, the light is coming from a very down-to-earth, useful thing, a lighthouse. It's very modern. It had only been there for 30 or 40 years. And then the sky, instead of all being swirls and stuff, is all straight lines. It's very geometric and lovely. And then the light, the shining through from beneath the ground as it does in Downland. His exhibition was in May 1939, was a great success. The critics came for the first time en masse. They used words like magical and mystical. They couldn't quite work out what it was he was doing. They knew they liked it, but they couldn't place him anywhere. So he was much buoyed by the positive response, and set out he painted what his wife Tirzah described as 6 stunners, which apparently is what the pre-Raphaelite artists used to call their women. It's rather sexist, yes, but they used to call them stunners. And so these were 6 stunners, and one of these stunners was his glorious watercolor of the Wilmington Giant, which is in the show. with its lovely strands of barbed wire, a modern eyesore to most people and landscape painters, but not to him. So this was in 1939. The previous Christmas, a book had come out, his book had come out, High Street, a book of shops. And this was a book of lithographs rather than wood engravings, colour lithographs. And it was published by Noel Carrington, who was a publisher at Country Life Books. And it was a lovely book that they very much enjoyed working on together. And Carrington had the idea of using this kind of lithography to emulate what had been going on in Russia under the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a great force in art, the early years of the Soviet Union. They had a lot of amazing art innovations. They're very famous posters and design, but also in book illustration and book production. They used lithography to produce books like this one, Posta. They would produce them really cheaply and print them in hundreds of thousands and then distribute them free to try and educate people. And Carrington had the idea of making something similar in Britain, and he approached Penguin, the publishers, and the Penguin model was all about selling really cheap but producing the books even cheaper. And so they liked the idea of these very beautifully made, beautifully colored, beautifully produced, but very affordable books. And so Carrington was commissioned to produce the Puffin picture books. And Ravilious Carrington sent Ravilious off just after the war broke out in the autumn of 1939 to make a whistle-stop tour of Downland figures, chalk figures. And he went to Uffington, the Vale of the White Horse, for which he made use of aerial photography, because I don't think you can see the horse looking quite so horse-like from the ground, whereas you, as I think on very much can from the air. This was one of the great beauties of aerial photography, that you could see these images for the first time, and so they almost became modern icons. In fact, the modernity of this kind of imagery was not lost on the modern artists of the day. And John Piper, who was at the cutting edge really of modern art in Britain in the mid to late 1930s, his wife Mafanoe Evans produced this really wonderful, short-lived but wonderful art magazine, Axis, a very rare example of an avant-garde British magazine. And an issue from 1937, Piper wrote about prehistory as it was photographed from the air, and how these aerial photographs almost look like abstract European paintings. And he contrasted this view of Silbury from a photograph with above, I think William Stukely drawing of Silbury Hill. And it's very interesting if you bear in mind the drawing of Silbury. So this was very much of its moment, as I was saying before, that Downland was in the culture, and now it had become introduced into modern art itself, and also into modern politics. The Ramblers Association meeting at Westbury White Horse, trespassing on Westbury White Horse in the late 30s, was an image that was reproduced in all of the sort of left-leaning newspapers and magazines that Ravilious used to look at. So he would have known this image and would have been aware of the vantage point that he was using when he portrayed the Westbury Horse, which is a very modern kind of watercolor. It feels very light and sort of fresh and sculpted, but it does also go back to those antiquarian drawings of William Stukely from the, I'm going to get this wrong, 17th century. I'm sure David could correct me on that one. So it has a sort of one foot in the past, as I think Ravilious so often did have. And as Edward Thomas was talking about, you know, the Downland was making Ravilious think of the past, but also of the present and future in the way that he portrayed the horse, and of course with the train, bringing it up into the modern age, running along in the distance. He even put in the sign, which is shown here. I'm not sure what it actually says, but there's a young chap sitting on the sign above the horse. I'm not sure why somebody would necessarily want a postcard of the view from the horse, but anyway, it's a lovely image, and we used it on the back of the catalogue. Hopefully nobody thought it was Ravilious, but it is the sort of position he would have taken up doing his drawings. There's a lovely collection of postcards. There are hundreds we could have put into the exhibition, and in the end we just put in a small selection. So here is the horse seen from below, and here it reappears in the painting Train Landscape, which is far away in Aberdeen at the moment. I wasn't allowed out to come and be in our show, but here is the view the other way round. And of course, being Ravilious, you get a lovely sense of the interior, and a sense that someone has been sitting here until very recently, sitting on the seats. They're all nice and worn, and we're as if looking out of the window at the horse, but at the same time there's this dreamlike kind of quality about the watercolor. So no sooner had he been around and he made these drawings than he was appointed a war artist. And I realize it's 8:30, but we're just going to end a little bit late, I'm afraid. Sorry. He was appointed a war artist, which it was December 1939. He described it as a Christmas present from the Admiralty. He's invited by the Admiralty to come and work as an honorary captain in the Royal Marines, and to work on naval subjects, broadly speaking. So here he is in the spring of 1940, looking not very smart in his uniform, next to John Nash over on the right, and in between Barnett Friedman, another friend, fellow artist, looking very smart in his uniform, like a World War I general. And he apparently asked the War Office if he could have a gun to finish off his outfit. And they said no, which was probably quite wise. But Ravilious instead offered him a whistle, which sort of tells you how warlike Ravilious was, i.e. not at all. But he wanted to do his bit, and he did his bit as a war artist. So intriguingly, and this was, again, when we were putting the exhibition together, and I was thinking about it and sort of thinking what the sort of point of it was, what the wider premise of it was, I kind of realized that so many of the places he'd gone in his career were connected to the Downs. And when he was sent off to portray coastal defences, which came under the aegis of the Navy, he found himself back in the Downland again. So here we are in Newhaven, looking over the port. Compared to the watercolor of Beachy Head, the lighthouse at night, you'll see how much looser and freer and more rapid the painting is, because he now couldn't afford to spend weeks in his studio poring over these works in the tiniest detail. He had to make the work quickly. A year later, he was in Dover, and he was posted to Dover, which was at the time, it's rather hard, kind of curious to think about it. It was kind of the front line. Well, it was the front line. And you had this sort of shelling going on backwards and forwards. And of course, Allied planes going over to bomb and vice versa. This view, I think he had a little bit of time to do. And you can see here, it's full of incident. These, I think, are some sort of anti-invasion defense, these posts, though I may be wrong about that. And then we have here this this concrete wedge, which is an antique, really. It's an acoustic mirror, which was put up just after World War One it's a sort of giant kind of amplifying device, so that the sound of an aircraft approaching across the channel would be amplified and you would have early warning. Of course, it was made obsolete by radar, which is probably one reason Ravilious included it as something fun. I had to include this. He was staying very close to where this photograph was taken of some chickens being raised on the seafront in Dover. And when he was billeted just to the south of the port proper, the shelling would be going on. And these giant guns on either side of the channel, I think the ones in the cliffs above Dover were called Winnie and Pooh, and they're these massive naval guns which could fire across the channel. And so they had this slow motion duel for years during the war. The guns on either side didn't never really hit anything, but they would sort of fire and keep everyone honest by landing a shell in the water every so often. And so he would rush up when he heard shelling start, and rush up the cliff and try and capture what he saw, drawing for inspiration, I think, on his extensive knowledge of old illustrations of fireworks. He was very keen on fireworks, and he used to look at, he had books. He had a book about the Brock Firework Company, and would look back at 18th century depictions, etchings, engravings of fireworks to inspire him during the war, which is where I think this sort of very stylized flame comes from in firing a 9.2 gun. I mean, you look at this gun and you think, you know, it's like a little toy gun. It's not going to hurt anybody. And he later in the war, he refused to paint bombers because of what they did. Essentially, he preferred to paint air sea rescue aircraft because he was, you know, quite pacifically minded. But you do get a sense of the power of the weapon as it's being fired, in these plants in the foreground, which seem to be sort of shaking almost with the sound of the gun going off. So at this point, he was still working for the Navy, but at the end of 1941, he wanted a change. He asked to be transferred to the Air Force, and then he spent the spring and summer learning how to draw aircraft and aircraft in flight, and flying himself, which he very much enjoyed, seeing the land from above as he'd seen in aerial photos. Then he was asked for a posting to the north, where he'd previously traveled, and he ended up going to Iceland, and he was in Iceland at the beginning of September 1942 when he went on an air sea rescue mission, and his plane, looking for another plane, his plane was lost and was presumed to have crashed, and he left behind his wife Tirzah and 3 young children, John, the oldest, James, and Anne. And Tirzah was left in very ill health herself, but she kind of rallied. She remarried, and then she enjoyed a brief but prolific little career before she herself sadly died young, as an oil painter. And she painted a series of really beautiful, strange oil paintings, and in this case, this is a toy train that belonged to them, and whereas Ravilious's trains always look a bit like toys, this is literally a toy train that she's placed in the Sussex landscape, a stylized version of the Sussex landscape, with these very naturalistic heads of corn and chickens, but the scale is all wrong, so it looks very odd. Not sinister, but just strange. Meanwhile, the picture puffins were in full production, and they went through, I'm sure some of you would have owned them at some point or seen them or looked at them. I can remember them from the sort of early 70s, having them around. And they were produced by real experts in their field, like Bassett Loke, who was the great model seller, and illustrated by artists. And here is the one that Ravilious should have made, would have made. Basically, he completed the dummy, which is, you know, it's a very rough outline of what he wanted to do, probably in the early 1940, and he sent it off to Carrington, who received it and said, I absolutely love this. And his idea was, well, let's call it Downland Man, because then we can get in some, it's not just about the chalk figures, it's also about the culture of the Downs. And we'll get Massingham to write the text, the guy who'd written the book Downland Man. And then at the end of his letter, he said, oh, actually, we don't need to pay Massingham, I'll write the text. And then he said at the very end of the letter, I will take very good care of your dummy while you're working, because Ravilious has said to him, look, I'm working as a war artist, I don't have time to do this, but when I get a break, when I come home and I get a few months off, I'll sit down and do it. He never got the opportunity. And Carrington said, I'll look after it. And then later on, because he didn't know where it was, he told everybody that he thought Ravilious had taken it with him to Iceland. But as we know, in fact, he had given it to Roland Collins. This is what the inside looks like. There's one or two of the photos are loose, and we've got them in the display next to the book. He wasn't going to put the photographs in the book. Please note, the watercolors were his starting point. He was going to make a whole new set of lithographs to illustrate the book with. They would have been made on one single plate, all the pages, and they would have been designed to all flow into one another as a unified book. It would have been absolutely sensational, but we had no idea really what it would have looked like. But rather than add on any sort of a sad note, I'd like to just leave it with this lovely watercolor of Wiltshire, which to me is one of the most serene, I think, and peaceful of Ravillious's works. And it's, I think, the one that has probably grown on me the most from the moment when I was putting the show together to having it on the wall and having been back numerous times to look. It is just a wonderfully artfully made, simple and beautiful watercolor. And so we will leave it there. I'm happy to answer any questions. As David said, a few dates, which I hope I've spelt all this right, because I wrote all this in about 10 seconds. The exhibition is on, I believe, until the 30th of January. As David said, please don't wait until the 25th of January and then try and come, because the chances are that the last week or two will be very full, if not sold out, because that's the way it tends to go with shows like this. There's a catalogue you can get from the website or the shop, and there is going to be another Ravilious show through a quirk of timing that is at least partly related to COVID, opening in February in Winchester, a completely different kind of show that I've also curated. And if you happen to be in Sussex, you can visit Ravillious's work at the Towner in Eastbourne. And on that note, I shall see if David is still there. Oh, there he is. I don't know what's happened to me. Oh, here I'm here too. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this. And if I've left anything out or you're confused about anything, just pop it in the questions and I will do my best to answer.
That was fantastic, James. Thank you so much. And while you're doing the adverts, can I also do an advert for the Fry Gallery in Saffron Walden, who also has a fantastic collection of Ravilious works, because, of course, he lived for many years in Essex, particularly in Great Bardfield. And so the Fry Gallery is a fantastic place to visit.
But please note, they're only open, unless they've changed, they're not open until Easter.
That's right.
And then they're only open quite odd days. So
Yeah.
if you're going to
Do
go there,
check.
check beforehand. Yeah.
But it's a great place to visit. Almost as good as going to Eastbourne and Lewes. Okay, so if you want to ask any questions, you see on the bottom of your screen there's a button labeled Q&A. So just start typing in. David posted one which says, which isn't me, I hasten to add. James, please could you say something about Ravilious's watercolor brush technique and how different it was from traditional watercolorists?
Oh, that's a great a great question. Has anyone got another hour? I didn't really I didn't really talk much about technique. It's an interesting one actually, because he used a lot of different techniques, and I'm sure if you are a watercolorist or you know a lot about watercolor and you've been around the show, you will have seen that. And like the wartime work, I'll stop sharing my screen now, hang on a sec. Oh, I can't remember how to do it. I'll have to leave it there.
I've done it anyway.
So he used a lot of different techniques. He used you know, the traditional kind of washes and stuff, and then he used his dry brush, which he learned primarily from Paul Nash, which is sort of dry and scratchy rather than wet traditional watercolor. But I think most of what he learned had been done in the 18th century and early 19th century. There was very little that was actually brand new. It was more the way he used it and the way he combined different things. And he and Edward Borden spent 2 or 3 years in Great Barfield in the early 30s, basically learning or seeing what you could do, what you could make watercolor do, and get away with it. And so he used all kinds of different techniques over the very brief period of his career. And you really, I think, have to go and look at the work in person and really think about it to sort of figure it all out. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I'm very struck what you've said previously about the link with wood engraving and the techniques he brought from wood engraving into his watercolors. Well,
I think the mark making was interesting, and that was something that, again, he and Borden did sort of together in watercolor. But for they were both printmakers, and for Ravilious, I think he had a sort of it was a way of, for wood engraving, it was a way of finding a shorthand or a sort of an equivalent, if you like, for naturally occurring shapes or textures or reflections on water or whatever it was. And he would find ways of doing that with marks and in black and white. And of course, wood engraving being black and white and always very small, it forced him to be very economical and very inventive in the way that he represented whatever it was he was trying to represent. And so imagine you're working on this scale all the time, and suddenly you've got a piece of paper this big. It's like having a sort of wall to paint on. And so he was used to that idea of covering every inch in texture. And when he had the time to do it, he did it. And then, of course, as a war artist, he had less time. So you see painting almost more like a sort of, you know, an impressionist or someone like Seurat or you know, somebody like that, more painterly coming in.
Okay, thank you. Some questions coming in now. First one from Jono. Do any sketchbooks exist that might give more clues to his working methods?
Very few sketchbooks. There are various odd bits of paper that have sort of tests on them of where he's tried out watercolor and tried laying colors over each other and that sort of thing. And then there are wartime drawings that he used, but he didn't really use sketchbooks. He had scrapbooks, which they're quite interesting. They don't reveal an enormous amount, because it was really when he was working on a watercolor, he was just there on that piece of paper from the beginning. If it didn't work, he'd rip it up. So he ripped up sort of 3 out of 4 that he started. And he never told anybody how he did the work or why he did it. So it's, you know, from my point of view, it's always been quite fun that there are no definitive answers to things, but also frustrating that so much is guesswork.
But didn't Peggy Angus talk about him sort of striding out into the countryside with his easel at first thing in the morning and knocking out a picture almost sort of within a couple of few hours?
Well, I think he was capable of doing that, and certainly you can see work that's been done fairly quickly, but certainly something like his watercolor of the Wilmington Giant. I mean, you're looking at long hours at the kitchen table. Christine Nash, John Nash's wife, left a lovely description of him staying with them and working upstairs in his room, and then she'd hear him walking to the bathroom and then the taps running and sort of scrubbing noises. And it was very common, and it is very common, and watercolorists, any watercolorist listening will no doubt agree, for a watercolor painter to wash off their paper. So they'll start, and if it doesn't seem quite right, they'll just wash the paper. And that leaves a kind of, it always leaves a sort of a trace of the paint is still there, which adds to the texture. But the paper is very tough, and you can abuse it in all sorts of ways, which he did.
Fascinating. So Susan has said his palette appears to be quite limited. Was it, or was it actually more diverse than it appears to be?
So his palette was, in this instance, slightly limited by the subject area that we're looking at. So you know, it's downland work, so it's landscape colors. He did use brighter colors, like he had a yellow he was very fond of, and blues he used quite often. However, he very rarely used watercolor in that very striking and powerful way that it can be used. And the reason for that was his technique was so much about lightness and letting the paper shine through the pigment, that he couldn't use strong color, because if he did, he would lose that texture, if you see what I mean. So he always had to use the color quite sparingly, and so the color tended to end up being quite muted. And it used to drive him crazy, because his favorite artists, strangely enough, were people like Winifred Nicholson, who was as pure a colorist as you could ever hope to encounter, and painted glorious flower pictures with just bursting color. And he really wanted to be that artist, but in order to be him, he couldn't. So he was always, you know, as we all are, frustrated by our limitations. And in this case, it was a sort of being caught between this very, very beautiful, light, delicate quality, and the fact that he really, in a way, wanted to be very bold.
You wonder about the ones he ripped up.
Yeah. Yeah.
How many he tried to do that.
Yeah.
And Lorna Jane has asked an interesting one, which is, how much has the color in his works changed over time, particularly after everyone smoked?
Yeah. Actually, smoking isn't the worst thing. It's because you can clean that. It's the light. And as I know, to my frustratingly, quite often you'll ask for a watercolor from an institution, and they'll say, no, you can't have it, it's been out too much, because watercolors can't be exposed to the light too much, and that is what damages them. Now, I think in the exhibition, there's really very little light damage on anything. Here and there possibly, and there were certain pigments that were tended to be badly affected. I think there was an indigo that they were all using, which is a bit fugitive, and so you find that disappearing here and there. But they've, generally speaking, I think that most of the works in the show have been in museums since pretty much since they were painted. So they've been looked after very carefully. And the ones in private collections have been hung away from the light. And so there's no, I mean, I have seen watercolors of his that have lost pigment, and it's very sad. And that's one of the reasons watercolor has a bad reputation, because people have seen the work from the 18th century, but they've seen examples that have either fugitive colors or they've been badly treated. If you find a Cotman that's been in a box for 200 years, they're just gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. But you have to know where to go and look for them.
Yeah. It's a real reminder. We for the gallery, we have to go and check the light level twice a day to make sure it doesn't get above 50 lux, and we check that there's 0 UV from the LED lights. So
Yeah,
it's a real problem, because the lighting has to be quite low, but at the same time, it's for the long term.
but it's the only way that they would be
long term of the picture.
Yeah, it's the only way that they would be allowed out, basically.
Yeah. Okay, well, with that, unless anyone has a very quick question, then it's almost 9 o'clock. So I think it's probably time for you to turn into a pumpkin, or find that glass of wine that's probably waiting to say hello. And
yeah, it's been a long day.
Yeah, if I can thank you again for this, yet again for a wonderful talk, and for acting as the guest curator for the exhibition. And thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Thanks everyone. Good night.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you everyone for coming. Goodbye. Good night.